There is a silent problem that is destroying the academic life of many people, and almost no one notices it in time. It's not a lack of study. It's not a lack of effort. It's the fact of studying for years without learning to memorize correctly. And when this is not corrected early, the damage accumulates. You study today and forget tomorrow. You review, understand it in the moment, but when it comes time to use the content, it simply disappears. Gradually, the brain starts to associate studying with frustration. The feeling arises that nothing sticks, that all effort is temporary. And this deeply undermines confidence. The most dangerous thing is that many people believe this is normal. That forgetting is part of it. That a good memory is a talent. But science shows something different. Memorization is not a gift. It is a trainable skill. The problem is that most people train their brains exactly to forget. When you study the wrong way, the brain understands that information is not important in the long run. He discards it. Not out of malice, but for efficiency. The brain only retains what is repeatedly required of it in the right way. If you don't learn to memorize now, the cost will come later. More hours of study, more stress, more rework. Until the moment comes when the routine breaks because the effort yields no return. In this video, you will learn how to truly memorize content. Not memorizing for a few days, but building solid memory that withstands time and use. Before studying becomes an endless cycle of forgetting. If you've ever felt like you study a lot and forget quickly, subscribe to the channel now. Here, the focus is on truly learning, using cognitive science, memory psychology, and methods that work in the real world. Before learning memorization techniques, it is essential to understand why most people forget so quickly. The brain was not made to store everything you consume. It was made to filter. And it filters based on a simple criterion. What is not required is not retained. When you study only by reading, attending classes, or rereading notes, the brain goes into passive mode. It recognizes the information, but does not treat it as something that will need to be used in the future. That's why, a few days later, almost everything disappears. The mistake is not in forgetting. It's in never having taught the brain to remember. Memory is not built with exposure. It is built with retrieval. Whenever you need to pull information from your mind without help, the brain understands that it is important. Another critical factor is the lack of structure. Loose information doesn't stick. The brain memorizes better when it can connect ideas, create relationships, and understand the context. Studying without organizing the content is like trying to store objects thrown on the floor. Everything gets lost. This wrong process repeats itself for years. The person studies, forgets, reviews from scratch, forgets again. The effort increases, but the memory does not consolidate. This generates mental fatigue and demotivation. Memorizing correctly requires aligning the method with the functioning of human memory. Create the right effort, at the right time, in the right way. When this happens, the brain stops discarding information and starts to protect it. The most important principle of real memorization is simple, but almost no one applies it. The brain only memorizes what it needs to actively retrieve. It's not the time of exposure that matters, it's the effort of retrieval. Whenever you try to remember something without looking, your brain understands that information has value. When you study and then immediately check the material, the brain doesn't work. It just recognizes. But when you close the content and try to explain it in your own words, even if you make mistakes, something different happens. The neural connections begin to strengthen. It is at this moment that memory begins to form. At the beginning, this process is uncomfortable. It seems like you don't know anything. But that feeling is deceptive. It does not indicate incapacity. It indicates that the brain is being challenged. And what is demanded is learned. Another essential point is to avoid always studying with support. Prepared summaries, others' mind maps, and answers right below the question sabotage memorization. They reduce the effort of retrieval. To memorize, you need to fight a little against forgetting. This principle completely changes the way of studying. Instead of trying to absorb everything, you start constantly testing what you remember. The study transforms into memory training, not information consumption. Over time, the brain adapts. Remembering becomes easier. Confidence grows. The content starts to emerge naturally when needed. For memorization to truly work, the retrieval effort needs to be organized over time. This is where many people go wrong. They try to remember everything in one day, or only review when they feel they have completely forgotten. None of these approaches respect how memory works. The brain memorizes better when it is forced to remember at the moment when the information begins to weaken but has not yet disappeared. This point creates an ideal effort. Neither too easy nor impossible. It is in this moderate effort that neural connections are strengthened. That's why reviewing correctly is not repeating everything every day. It's spacing out the reviews. Study today, try to remember tomorrow, then a few days later, then weeks later. Each attempt to retrieve reconstructs the memory and makes it more resistant to forgetting. Another common mistake is reviewing passively. Reread, watch again, skim through the summary. This gives a sense of security, but it doesn't strengthen memory. To truly review is to try to remember before checking. Always. This principle drastically reduces the total study time. Instead of relearning everything from scratch before an exam, you keep the content active over time. The brain understands that this information is recurring and needs to be preserved. When spacing is applied correctly, something changes. Forgetting slows down. Memory becomes stable. The study ceases to be a cycle of loss and recovery and becomes continuous construction. Another decisive factor for truly memorizing is the way the content is organized in the mind. The brain doesn't like loose information. It memorizes better when it can create clear relationships between ideas. When you study without structure, memory becomes fragile and easy to lose. Many people try to memorize lists, isolated definitions, and disconnected formulas. This requires a lot of effort and yields little result. The brain needs meaning. He wants to understand why something exists, how it connects with what has already been learned, and in what context it will be used. Studying correctly involves creating internal mental maps. Not just in the visual sense, but conceptual. Constantly asking how this concept relates to others, what the central idea is, and what details depend on it. When you understand the structure, the details fit together much more easily. Another important point is to explain the content as if you were teaching someone. When you organize information to explain, the brain needs to order ideas, eliminate excesses, and reinforce connections. This process deeply strengthens memory. This habit drastically reduces the need to memorize. Instead of trying to remember each detail individually, you remember the general logic. And from it, the details emerge naturally. When the content makes sense within a clear structure, the brain stops struggling to memorize. He understands. And what is understood is remembered for much longer. A silent mistake that destroys memorization, even for those who study a lot, is trying to memorize everything with the same level of importance. The brain doesn't work that way. It prioritizes. When everything seems equally relevant, nothing stands out and memory becomes confused and fragile. Many people study as if every detail carries the same weight. They try to memorize all the sentences, all the examples, all the variations. This overloads the brain and drastically increases the chance of forgetting. The brain needs to know what is central and what is secondary. Correctly memorizing involves hierarchizing the content. Identify main ideas, basic concepts, and central structures. The details exist to support these ideas, not to compete with them. When the foundation is clear, the details naturally organize themselves around it. Another important point is to avoid mechanical memorization without understanding. Memorizing something that doesn't make sense creates a weak memory, easy to lose. When you understand the reason behind the information, the brain creates more connections and the memory strengthens. This habit requires constant questioning during study. What is essential here? What can I forget without losing understanding? What supports everything else? These questions train the brain to memorize intelligently. When you stop trying to remember everything and start remembering what matters, memorization improves quickly. Studying becomes easier. Clarity increases. And memory starts to work in your favor, not against you. To ensure that the content truly stays in memory, it is essential to learn how to test the right way. Most people only find out they haven't memorized when it's already too late. In the exam, in the presentation, or when applying the knowledge. This happens because there was never a real test during the study. Testing memory is not checking if the content seems familiar. It's checking if it can be retrieved without support. Close the material and try to remember. Answer blank questions. Explain the topic without consulting anything. This type of test reveals what is truly stored. At first, this can cause discomfort. You notice flaws, forgetfulness, and gaps. But this discomfort is valuable. It shows exactly where the memory is still weak. And it allows for correction before forgetting becomes ingrained. Another important point is to test at different times. Right after studying, after a few hours, after a few days. Each test strengthens memory in a different way. The brain learns that this information will be required in various contexts and starts to protect it better. This habit completely changes the confidence in learning. Instead of relying on the feeling that you rely on evidence. You know what you remember and what you need to reinforce. When testing becomes a natural part of studying, memorization stops being a matter of luck. It becomes predictable. You study knowing that the content will remain. For memorization to work in the long term, it needs to be integrated into a simple and sustainable routine. The mistake many people make is turning studying into something heavy, complex, or impossible to maintain. When this happens, consistency breaks and memory weakens again. Memorizing correctly does not require studying all day long. It requires regularity. Small, well-done study blocks, repeated over time, have much more impact than long, sporadic sessions. The brain learns better when the effort is frequent and predictable. Another essential point is to separate moments of learning from moments of memorizing. First, you understand the content. Then, you practice retrieval. Mixing everything at the same time creates confusion. When each step has its space, the brain responds better. This habit also involves reviewing what has already been studied before moving on to something new. Not to delay progress, but to ensure that the foundation is solid. When the foundation fails, the subsequent content becomes more difficult to memorize. An efficient memorization routine does not need to be rigid. It needs to be clear. Know what to study, when to review, and how to test your memory. This reduces anxiety and increases confidence in the process. When memorization becomes a natural part of the routine, studying stops being a cycle of forgetting. You start to feel that the content stays. And this feeling completely changes the relationship with learning. When all these principles start working together, something important happens. Memorization ceases to be an isolated effort and becomes a natural part of learning. The brain begins to recognize patterns, anticipate reviews, and respond better to retrieval tests. Studying becomes more efficient without requiring more time. At this stage, you realize that you no longer depend on the fleeting feeling of confidence. You know you remember because you've already tested it, has already recovered. It was reinforced at the right time. This completely changes mental security during exams, presentations, and practical applications. Another important effect is the reduction of stress. When memory is built correctly, studying stops being a race against forgetting. You don't need to relearn everything from scratch. The content is there, accessible, organized. The brain works with you, not against you. This process also improves discipline. When the effort produces visible results, the brain begins to associate studying with reward. The resistance decreases. Procrastination loses its grip. Studying stops being something you avoid and becomes something that makes sense. Many people believe that a good memory is genetic. But what really sets apart those who memorize well is the method. Those who learn to memorize correctly build a cumulative advantage. Each new content builds on the previous one. Learning to truly memorize is a game changer. When you understand how the brain decides what to keep and what to discard, studying stops being a game of chance and becomes a predictable process. You no longer depend on desperate reviews or long hours trying to relearn what should already be solid. The biggest mistake is not forgetting. It's never having taught the brain to remember. When you apply active recall, spaced reviews, content organization, and constant testing, memory strengthens over time. Knowledge stops evaporating. It accumulates. This type of learning changes everything. The tests stop being threats. The new content becomes easier to absorb because the foundation is solid. Confidence grows because you know that the effort is being converted into real memory. If you feel that you study a lot and retain little, this is the time to change. The longer you wait, the harder it becomes to correct bad habits. Learning to memorize now avoids years of rework and frustration. If this video made sense to you, subscribe to the channel. Here you learn how to study intelligently, using cognitive science, memory psychology, and methods that work in the real world. Also, leave a like so that this content reaches more people who are stuck in the forgetting cycle. Remember this. It's not a lack of ability that prevents you from moving forward. It's the wrong method. When you learn to memorize correctly, studying stops being a burden and becomes a real advantage that stays with you for life.